Imagine this. You're speaking to a woman who once felt warm, present, almost inevitable in your world. And then one day, without warning, without explanation, without a final word to hold on to, she vanishes. No argument, no dramatic goodbye, no closure to soothe the restless mind. Just absence, a silence so complete it begins to echo. And what remains is not peace, but a question that refuses to die. In the language of Carl Jung, the psyche does not fear endings, it fears the unresolved. It is not loss that haunts a man, but the mystery he cannot master. The woman who disappears without closure does not simply leave his life. She infiltrates his unconscious. Because what she takes with her is not just her presence, she takes the ending. And without an ending, the mind cannot file her away as past. So, she becomes something else entirely. She becomes myth. There is a certain archetype that lives beneath the surface of this phenomenon. The elusive feminine, the anima in its most untamed form. Not the woman who explains herself, not the one who negotiates her worth, but the one who withdraws without seeking to be understood. She does not collapse into emotional overexposure. She does not beg to be seen clearly. She allows herself to remain partially unknown. And this is precisely where her power begins. Because the masculine psyche, driven by logic and control, is trained to resolve, to fix, to define. When something or someone refuses definition, it does not get dismissed. It gets obsessed over. You see, a man can forget a woman who argues, who pleads, who explains every emotion until nothing is left to interpret. But the woman who leaves without revealing her final truth, she becomes an unfinished sentence in his mind. And the human mind cannot tolerate unfinished sentences. It returns to them again and again. Have you ever noticed how memory behaves? It does not replay what is complete. It loops what is unresolved. It sharpens what is unclear. It magnifies what it cannot fully grasp. And so, her silence becomes louder than any words she could have spoken. Not because she tried to haunt him, but because she refused to soothe him. There is a quiet cruelty and a profound self-respect in that choice. To walk away without offering closure is to deny the other person the comfort of narrative control. It is to say without saying that your peace is not dependent on being understood. And this disrupts the ego in a way that no confrontation ever could. The ego seeks closure not for healing, but for control. It wants to place the other person into a category, good, bad, right, wrong, so it can move on with a sense of certainty. But when she disappears without explanation, she removes herself from all categories. She becomes undefined. And what is undefined becomes infinite in the imagination. You begin to see how this is not about manipulation, but about detachment. The woman who disappears in this way is not playing a game. She has simply reached a point where explaining herself feels like a betrayal of her own inner truth, where staying feels heavier than leaving, where speaking would only dilute what silence can preserve. This is not avoidance. This is alignment. In Stoic philosophy, there is a quiet understanding that not everything deserves a response. As Marcus Aurelius once reflected, the greatest power lies not in reacting, but in choosing what remains untouched by reaction. The woman who disappears embodies this principle, not through coldness, but through clarity. She does not abandon herself to keep someone else comfortable, and that, more than anything, is what unsettles him. Because somewhere deep within, beyond the ego's demand for answers, he recognizes what she has done. He recognizes that she chose herself without asking for permission, that she exited without waiting to be validated, that she trusted her internal compass more than his external understanding. And this recognition begins to fracture something, not just his attachment to her, but his perception of himself, because now he is left alone with questions he cannot outsource, questions about why she left, questions about what he missed, questions about whether he ever truly saw her, or only projected onto her what he needed her to be. This is where Jung's concept of projection becomes unavoidable. The more mysterious she becomes in absence, the more he begins to confront what he placed onto her. His idealizations, his fantasies, his unacknowledged desires. She becomes a mirror, even in her disappearance. And the haunting begins not because she is gone, but because she revealed something that remains, something unresolved within him. And what remains does not fade with time the way ordinary memories do. It deepens. It embeds itself quietly into the architecture of his inner world, surfacing in moments he does not expect, in the stillness before sleep, in the spaces between conversations, in the faces of other women, who, no matter how present, seem somehow incomplete, because they arrive with explanations, and explanations, while comforting, do not penetrate the psyche the way mystery does. You begin to understand now, this is not about her absence alone. It is about the psychological rupture her absence creates, the interruption of narrative. The refusal to offer closure becomes an open loop, and the masculine mind, wired to seek resolution, becomes trapped inside it. But beneath this surface-level obsession lies something far more ancient, a confrontation with the shadow. Carl Jung spoke of the shadow as the part of the self that remains unacknowledged, repressed, or denied. It is not inherently dark, it is simply unseen. And often it is through others that this shadow is activated, through attraction, through conflict, through loss, through her. When she leaves without closure, she does not just remove herself from his life. She removes the distraction. She takes away the external focus that once absorbed his attention. And what replaces it is not emptiness, but exposure. Exposure to himself. You see, as long as she was present, he could project. He could assign meaning, attribute blame, construct narratives that kept his inner world intact. But once she disappears without giving him the final piece of the puzzle, those projections collapse inward, and what he is left with is raw, unfiltered introspection. Why does her silence disturb him more than her words ever did? Why does her absence feel heavier than her presence? Why does he replay conversations that no longer exist, searching for clues that were never meant to be found? Because somewhere within, he senses that what he lost was not just a woman. It was a version of himself that only existed in relation to her. This is where the real haunting begins, not in longing for her return, but in confronting the emptiness left behind when the identity he built around her dissolves, the role he played, the control he assumed, the certainty he believed he had. All of it is now uncertain, and uncertainty is the breeding ground of transformation. But transformation is rarely comfortable. It demands that he look at the parts of himself he avoided, the moments where he failed to listen, the ways in which he reduced her complexity into something manageable, the subtle arrogance of believing he understood her completely, when in truth, he only understood the version of her that fit his expectations. Her disappearance dismantles that illusion. And in doing so, it forces him into a deeper psychological process, individuation. Jung described individuation as the journey toward becoming whole, not perfect, but integrated, a process of reconciling the conscious self with the unconscious, of acknowledging the shadow rather than projecting it outward. And often, this journey begins with loss, with disruption, with a woman who refuses to stay where she is no longer aligned. You may wonder now, was her silence intentional? Was it designed to create this effect? But that question misses the point, because true power does not arise from manipulation. It arises from authenticity, from the courage to leave without explaining oneself into exhaustion, from the willingness to be misunderstood rather than betray one's inner truth. She did not disappear to haunt him. She disappeared because staying would have haunted her, and that distinction changes everything. In a world where so many seek closure as a form of emotional reassurance, her refusal to provide it becomes a radical act of self-respect. She does not linger to soften the impact. She does not offer explanations to ease his discomfort. She trusts that what is left unsaid will speak louder than anything she could articulate. And it does. It speaks in the quiet moments where he confronts his own limitations, in the subtle comparisons he makes without realizing, in the way he begins to question not just what happened, but who he was within the relationship. This is the deeper layer of attraction that most never understand. It is not about being unforgettable because of what was given. It is about being unforgettable because of what was never fully revealed. Because what is partially hidden invites pursuit, not of the person, but of the meaning behind them. And meaning, once sought, becomes addictive. You begin to see how her absence transforms into presence, not physically, but psychologically. She becomes an internal figure, a reference point, a question that shapes future decisions, future relationships, future perceptions. He may move on. He may meet others. He may even convince himself that he has forgotten. But something subtle lingers, a standard he cannot quite define, a feeling he cannot replicate, a silence that echoes louder than any voice. And perhaps the most unsettling realization of all is this: she never tried to stay. She never fought to be understood. She simply chose herself and left the rest unresolved. And in that unresolved space, something begins to shift in him, not all at once, not dramatically, but in quiet, almost imperceptible ways. The kind of shifts that do not announce themselves, yet slowly alter the structure of perception. Because once the illusion of certainty is broken, it cannot be fully restored. He begins to notice patterns, not in her, but in himself. The way he reacted when things felt uncertain. The way he avoided depth when it required vulnerability. The subtle resistance to truly seeing her, not as an extension of his needs, but as a separate, autonomous being with her own inner world. Her absence forces a confrontation with this truth, that he never fully met her where she existed, and now he cannot go back and correct it. This is where regret begins to take shape, not as a dramatic emotional collapse, but as a slow-burning awareness. A recognition that something valuable passed through his life, and he did not have the awareness, the presence, or perhaps even the emotional maturity to hold it. Regret, when it is honest, is not about wishing for a different outcome. It is about recognizing a different self that could have created one. And this recognition is deeply unsettling because it removes the comfort of blame. There is no argument to revisit, No final conversation to reinterpret. Only silence. And within that silence, the uncomfortable clarity that he must now sit with himself. You may think that time will dissolve this, but time does not erase what the psyche has not integrated. It simply buries it beneath distractions, new experiences, temporary attachments. Yet the unresolved does not disappear. It waits. It lingers beneath the surface, influencing choices, shaping reactions, subtly guiding behavior in ways that often go unnoticed, until something or someone activates it again. A look, a phrase, a moment that echoes her, and suddenly the memory returns, not as nostalgia, but as a question still unanswered. Why did she leave like that? Why did she not say more? Why did she not fight? But beneath these questions lies a deeper one, rarely acknowledged. Why did he need her to? Because closure in its most common form is not about understanding the other person. It is about avoiding the responsibility of understanding oneself. It provides a narrative that can be accepted, filed away, and forgotten. But she denied him that. She left him with the raw material of introspection, unfiltered, unstructured, and impossible to ignore indefinitely. This is the paradox of her disappearance. In leaving, she created a presence that endures, not because she stayed long enough to be remembered fondly, but because she left before she could be fully understood. And what is not fully understood continues to evolve in the mind. It grows, it reshapes, it becomes something larger than reality. This is not idealization in the romantic sense. It is psychological expansion. He begins to project onto her everything he now realizes he failed to recognize: depth, complexity, emotional intelligence, strength. And whether these qualities were fully present in her or not becomes irrelevant, because now they exist in his perception. And perception, once altered, cannot be undone. This is how she becomes more than a memory. She becomes a standard, a silent reference point that influences how he sees other women. Not consciously, not deliberately, but subtly. In the way he senses something missing, even when everything seems right. In the way he feels a lack of depth where once there was mystery. Because mystery cannot be manufactured. It emerges from authenticity, from the willingness to remain partially unknown even in connection. And this is what she embodied, not as a strategy, but as a state of being. You see, many attempt to create attraction through performance, through calculated behaviors, through controlled responses, through carefully crafted personas. But these efforts often collapse under the weight of inconsistency because they are not rooted in truth. She did not perform mystery. She was mystery. And that difference is what makes her unforgettable. There is a quiet sovereignty in a woman who does not feel compelled to explain herself into acceptance, who does not seek to resolve every misunderstanding, who understands that not all connections are meant to be completed, and that some are meant to remain open, not as wounds, but as lessons. This is where her power lies, not in leaving him confused, but in leaving herself intact. And perhaps, if you look closely, you will see that her disappearance was not an act of rejection. It was an act of self-preservation. She sensed something misaligned, something that could not be articulated without diminishing its truth. And instead of negotiating with that misalignment, she chose to honor it. Without drama, without explanation, without looking back. And in doing so, she forced him into a space he could not escape, the space of self-confrontation. Because when someone leaves without giving you a reason, you are left with only one place to look: within. And within that inward gaze, something begins to crystallize, not immediately, not comfortably, but inevitably. The mind, deprived of external answers, starts to turn its attention toward the internal landscape. At first, this movement feels like confusion, then resistance, then slowly, a kind of reluctant curiosity. Because there is something undeniable about silence. It does not argue, it does not defend, it simply exists, and in doing so, it reflects. What he begins to see in that reflection is not flattering. It is not the version of himself he would prefer to maintain. It is fragmented, incomplete, marked by blind spots he never had reason to examine before. And yet, there is also something strangely liberating in this realization. Because for the first time, the narrative is no longer about her. It is about him. Not in the superficial sense of ego, but in the deeper sense of responsibility. The kind that does not seek validation, but seeks truth. The kind that understands that every connection, no matter how brief, no matter how unresolved, reveals something essential about the self. Her absence becomes the catalyst, a silent invitation into a deeper layer of consciousness. This is where the process becomes almost alchemical. The discomfort he feels, the questions, the restlessness, the subtle ache of not knowing. These are not obstacles. They are raw material, the beginning of transformation, but only if he allows them to be. Many do not. Many distract themselves, rush into new attachments, bury the unresolved beneath noise and movement. And for a while, it works. The mind adapts, the intensity fades, the memory softens at the edges. But what remains unintegrated does not disappear. It waits. And when it returns, it does so with greater clarity. Because the psyche, as Jung understood, moves toward wholeness. It seeks integration, even when the conscious mind resists it. And the unresolved connection with her becomes one of the threads pulling him in that direction. He begins to notice his patterns more acutely. The way he approaches intimacy, the way he avoids emotional depth when it threatens his sense of control, the subtle fear of being truly seen, and the even deeper fear of truly seeing another. These are not comfortable realizations, but they are necessary, because without them, there is no growth, only repetition. And repetition, when unconscious, becomes a cycle. The same dynamics, the same misunderstandings, the same eventual breakdowns. Different faces, different names, but the same underlying pattern. Until something interrupts it. Until someone refuses to participate in it. She was that interruption, not because she tried to change him, but because she removed herself from the pattern entirely. And in doing so, she revealed it. This is the paradox of her impact. She did not stay to guide him, to explain, to teach. She did not offer him the comfort of closure or the illusion of resolution. Instead, she left him with something far more valuable, though it may not feel that way at first. She left him with himself. And in that solitude, something begins to emerge. Not immediately clarity, but awareness, the kind that cannot be unlearned. He starts to understand that what he felt for her was not just attraction, it was activation. She stirred something within him that had long been dormant, a sensitivity, a depth, a recognition of something beyond the surface level interactions he had grown accustomed to. And once that depth is experienced, even briefly, it becomes difficult to return to shallowness. This is why her absence lingers, not because she was perfect, but because she represented something real, something unfiltered, something that did not bend to accommodate expectations. And now, in her absence, he is faced with a choice: to ignore what has been revealed and return to familiar patterns, or to engage with it, to question, to reflect, to evolve. This is where the Stoic perspective offers a quiet but powerful insight. Epictetus taught that it is not events themselves that disturb us, but our interpretation of them. Her disappearance in itself is not inherently painful. It is the meaning he assigns to it, the stories he constructs, the assumptions he makes that shape his experience. And within that realization lies a form of freedom. Because if the meaning can be questioned, it can also be transformed. He can begin to see her not as a loss, but as a mirror. Not as an absence, but as a turning point. Not as someone who left him incomplete, but as someone who revealed the parts of him that were already incomplete. This shift is subtle, but it changes everything. Because now, the focus is no longer on what she did or did not do. It is on what he is willing to see. And in that willingness, something new begins to take form. Not obsession, not longing, but understanding. And understanding, when it is real, does not rush to conclusions. It lingers. It observes. It allows contradictions to exist without forcing them into resolution. This is where something profound begins to unfold. Not in the memory of her, but in the reconfiguration of him. Because once a man begins to see himself clearly, even in fragments, he can no longer fully return to blindness. There is a quiet grief in that awakening, not the kind that seeks sympathy, but the kind that reshapes perception. The realization that what was once taken for granted, connection, presence, emotional access, was never guaranteed. That it required a level of awareness he did not yet possess. And now, in her absence, he begins to develop it, slowly, reluctantly, but genuinely. This is the hidden gift of unresolved endings. They do not allow the psyche to settle into complacency. They disrupt the illusion of control. They create a tension that demands attention, not outward, but inward. And if he resists that tension, it becomes suffering. But if he leans into it, it becomes growth. You may begin to recognize something here, that the woman who disappears without closure is not just a figure of mystery or emotional intensity. She is a catalyst, a force that reveals the limitations of the ego and invites a deeper encounter with the self. She does not teach through explanation. She teaches through absence. And absence, when it is not numbed or avoided, becomes a space where new awareness can emerge. This is where the process of individuation continues, not as a concept, but as a lived experience, the integration of what was previously unconscious, the gradual alignment between what is felt and what is understood. He begins to take responsibility, not in a self-punishing way, but in a clarifying way. He sees where he projected, where he avoided, where he misunderstood, and instead of seeking to correct the past, he begins to adjust the present. His attention sharpens, his listening deepens, his need for control softens. Because he has seen what happens when connection is taken for granted, he has felt the impact of losing something he did not fully recognize while it was there. And that experience becomes a reference point, not for comparison, but for awareness. You may wonder if this means he will always think of her. And the answer is not simple. He may not think of her in the same way. The intensity may fade. The emotional charge may diminish. But the imprint she left, the shift she initiated, remains embedded in his way of being. She becomes less of a person in his mind and more of a moment, a turning point, a before and after. And this is where the narrative begins to change, because what once felt like haunting begins to transform into clarity. He no longer seeks to understand why she left in the way she did. He begins to understand what her leaving revealed, and in that understanding, something releases. Not entirely, not all at once, but gradually. The need for closure loses its urgency. The questions lose their grip. The silence no longer feels like a void, but like a completed space. This is the paradox. Closure was never something she could give him. It was something he had to arrive at on his own, through reflection, through discomfort, through the slow, deliberate process of integrating what was once avoided. And in doing so, he begins to embody a different kind of presence, one that is less reactive, less dependent on external validation, less driven by the need to define and control. He becomes more attuned, more aware, more capable of meeting another person as they are, rather than as he needs them to be. This is not perfection. It is evolution. And it is precisely because she did not stay to guide him through it that this evolution becomes possible. Had she remained, had she explained, had she softened the impact with words, the process might have been diluted. But she did not. She chose silence. And in that silence, she created a space for something deeper to emerge, not within the relationship, but within him. This is where the story reaches its quiet resolution, not in reunion, not in reconciliation, but in transformation. He no longer needs to revisit the past to understand it. He carries the understanding within him, and that understanding changes how he moves forward, how he connects, how he perceives, how he chooses. The woman who once felt like an unresolved mystery becomes a resolved influence, not forgotten, but integrated. And in that integration, there is a kind of peace. Not because everything was explained, but because nothing needs to be. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses.